Learning language seems to be a natural human ability. It may be one of the primary means of communication for us as humans. Learning a second language seems to be based on a person's intent to expand who they can communicate with. Today's focus is on how we best can learn a second language. Today on the podcast, we have Omar Newman, the owner of Carolina Language Solutions. That's www.multilingo.co. Multilingo. Omar is also a teacher in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. He's been teaching for over 10 plus years. Today, he's going to give you some insights on how he learned the language, what you can do to improve your language, and share some of his journeys throughout the world so you can have an idea on how you can get your path going for language learning as well. Let's go. Okay, so today on the podcast, because I'm living in South America, specifically in Colombia, it's always been in my mind of how do people learn language. And today I have a friend of mine on that is, I would call an expert in language in itself. It's Omar is here, and specifically I wanted to get Omar on because he is a teacher of languages, but I wanted to find out as a language teacher 3 years in, what is the best practices for learning language. So Omar, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it for having me on.
And so what first I want you to introduce yourself just so like people listening have an idea of who you are, because I like to give intros, but I think what you can say about yourself is way more flattering than what anybody else can say.
Absolutely. My name is Omar. I am a Spanish language teacher here in Charlotte, North Carolina. This is my 19th year going into language teaching. I think initially going in, I didn't have the idea 19 years ago, 20 years ago in college that, oh yeah, I'll be a language teacher. However, I believe it was preeminent simply because in high school, and junior high school, and even going back further than that, being a semi-military brat. And what I mean by that, basically, my parents worked for the Department of Defense. So I had the opportunity to travel at a very young age to Europe and live in Europe for 3 years. And so I was exposed to various languages, however, the main one being German. And living in Germany growing up, that was something that, I realized, nobody or everybody doesn't speak English. There are different languages. And, it goes back to even before that, you learn, about Babylon and, languages being spoken. And I was not always a language person. I always thought, I'm a mathematics in itself is a language, math educators. So fast forward, I learned German enough to function within the language, not necessarily desired to learn. German was not something that sounded very smooth and easy on the ear for me. However, it was interesting to me. So, while living in Germany, I was exposed to friends and families that were from the United States, but were native speakers of Spanish. And people always ask me, nowadays, as I'm an older, adult, people, oh, how'd you, come across wanting to learn Spanish or, learning Spanish? And I always tell people I had one simple motivating factor, and that was back in like 1988 or 87. There was a movie that came out, which was The Three Amigos with Martin Short and Steve Martin and Chevy Chase. A comedy, but, they end up going into Mexico and, being a young kid, third grade, you're exposed to, movies. And I'm watching this movie and I'm like, man, these women are beautiful. Like, but they don't speak English. And like whatever they were saying, I was like, oh, man, I want to learn this. This is like, so interesting, be able to communicate with people like this. And even, watching the guy that was the boss, El Guapo, wanting to find out, later on what that meant and, the Spanish they were speaking, I was like, oh yeah, this is it for me. So third grade, I initially was exposed to it via that movie. And then even in my hometown of Fayetteville, North Carolina, we were fortunate enough to have older high school kids come into our elementary school. This is before they had, foreign language in elementary schools in North Carolina, that were actually held by a foreign language educator. We had high school students come and expose us to the language at an early age. Um, and so, learning basics, colors, things of that nature, animals, being able, say greetings and hello, greetings and goodbyes. That was an awesome thing to learn. And so I said, okay, this is cool. And this is prior to me going to Germany. So I had exposure to the language. Fast forwarding, high school, taking all of, your Spanish ones, the AP Spanish, did that, and I wouldn't say I was, able to communicate on a fluent or nearly fluent level. And I would never say that I was, advanced proficient in the language. However, going into college, I was like, hey man, I'm going to med school, doctor, that was my thing. Everybody had a dream.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was my dream. I'm going to med school. Yeah, science was not my thing once I got to college. I just figured, hey, math and science, I thought that was me, not me at all. So I said, well, what can I do, that's great or easy, that comes to me easily? And it was language. And so I said, well, let's go ahead and pursue Spanish. And as I was in college pursuing Spanish classes, I came across learning Portuguese. So I say that to say this, early exposure to a language as a child helped to, you know, graze and blow that pathway of language learning out the water for me. And I always say the earlier the better. However, that's not necessarily the only possibility for learning a language. And so now I leave college and I'm like, oh man, what can I do with this language? And once again, you got a dream. You got your Mission Impossibles that are on TV, and James Bond, and you see these. Oh man, they're speaking multiple languages. I'm gonna go into working for the government, and I'm gonna
Right.
translate, and I'm gonna be a spy. And yeah, no, that was not that was going to be um, good for me because I was a family guy. When you learn a language and you go into the CIA and those governmental positions, there's not there's no guarantee that you're always going to be able to be with your family. And so I said, well, what can I do with this language? And I left out an integral part as a high school student. Um, I also had the opportunity to go back and teach in elementary schools for 2 years when I was in Spanish 4 and AP Spanish. I could go to the elementary schools and teach Spanish and interact with young kids and help them to learn and see the light bulb go off as far as them learning to communicate in a foreign language. Now, what's interesting and ironic is I never knew that opportunity to teach those young kids would, come full circle, and that would be what I was doing today.
Awesome.
And not necessarily on an elementary level. I teach high school students now, so and I've always taught high school for the majority of my educator experience. So, whew, it's a whirlwind, but I always say it's very um, promising. It's a promising career as far as educating people in foreign languages because I have a motto and I have a mantra that I live by, which is I build bridges to connect, build bridges through language to connect people. Um, and so what I do with that is I give them the building blocks and the tools necessary to be able to communicate in somebody else's language, in a native language for someone from another country. So that's pretty much in a nutshell how I become, interested in teaching foreign language.
Well, it sounds fulfilling, and I could hear the energy where you're on a level of this is not what I do, this is who I am, and I think that makes it more powerful for people when you live that way.
Absolutely.
So, a quick question: so, how
Absolutely.
many languages do you speak?
Currently I only speak three. But what's interesting is, and I tell people all the time, once you learn one language, And it depends on the derivative of where they come from. For example, if it's a Latin-based language, um, your ability to function within various languages, i.e., take for example, I my first thorough or fully understanding language outside of English is Spanish. And being that I was able to learn Spanish, um, I was able to pick up Portuguese very easily, Brazilian Portuguese, and Portugal Portuguese is similar. It is just a slight difference, but ultimately they all are very relative to Spanish. And I say that to say, as I've grown as a foreign language teacher, it's become easier for me to pick up on French, being able to read French, understand it, not necessarily speak it, but being able to read it and understand it when somebody's speaking it. Same thing goes with Italian. So I can read it and understand it, not necessarily speak it, but that only comes with minimal practice. If I put in the effort, if anybody puts in the effort to learn a language, you can learn most. But I would say for a fact that I speak Spanish fluently, and Portuguese is like a very advanced proficient level. You just have to have constant exposure to be able to utilize the language.
So, but in total, it kind of sounds like you speak maybe six or seven, because I'm going to include English, because I have English, Spanish,
Right.
Portuguese,
Absolutely.
Italian, French, and I'm sure there's some German in there, since German is connected to
Right.
English.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Like I said, my reading proficiency is higher because I was exposed to it. And then there's certain words that I can pick up, and I'll get into that when you ask me about the most and the least effective, ways to learn a language. But yeah, so I would definitely include that as well.
So, so quick question. You mentioned something about levels. So I'm here. I'm in Manizales, Colombia, and I came here, and I was like, well, and I'll share why I came in a minute. But I'm here, and I'm a language teacher, and I enjoy it.
Yeah.
But in the same breath, I lack the passion you have. But I've always been interested
Right.
in the levels of language, because I know that from what I've learned, that languages go from A1 to C2, so to speak. And so for
Right.
you, what
Right.
what what levels would you say are the levels accurate? And in your opinion, like what levels should people kind of strive for? Because everyone can't strive, or don't strive for that C2 level. But what do you think about the levels and how they correlate to people?
Okay. So I'll step out of the high school educator realm and step into the private sector realm of learning language. And what I mean by that is there's two ways to learn a language. You can learn it academically, or you can learn it from a functionality standpoint. And so first and foremost, people have to identify which sector they want to be in. Do you want to learn it from an academic standpoint, or do you want to learn it to be able to function within a language as you are um, traveling, perhaps, or you're using it for business, things of that nature? So really, when it comes to levels, I don't really focus or harp on levels
Okay.
when I'm teaching language outside of the high school academic setting. Um, I teach it for utilization and functionality within a language. And so what I mean by that is there are three major components of learning a language. Well, three major components to be able to communicate in a foreign language. Um, can you speak in the present tense? Can you use the simple past tense? Can you use the simple future tense? If you can do those three things in a language, you can function and maneuver through a foreign country, that speaks that native language that you're trying to learn. So as far as the A1s to C2s, that's great, and people, there's some people that's, oh, I'm gonna go down, I'm gonna go to this school, and I'm gonna go to study this language. That's great. And if you're looking for certification and notification of which levels you have, obtained, that's awesome. However, for me, I'm more of a, hey, I'm gonna get you into a location. I'm gonna help you be able to function within that language, and then utilize the language components and rules and things that I've taught you to be able to maneuver on a daily basis.
Awesome. So, and you made a point about business. So, currently, if I'm correct, your business is called Carolina Language Solutions, right?
That is correct.
And the
Yes.
website
And
is www.multilingo.co, and that's multilingo.co. Is that correct?
yes, that is
All
correct.
right.
That's
So,
correct.
what inspired you to create that business? Because you were a teacher and you chose to go an entrepreneurial route, and that's not risky, but it takes courage to do that. So, what courage led you to that?
Okay, so I'll go back. This is an idea, a dream that I had, or I guess a more so of a goal that I wanted to obtain back in 2001. So leaving college, I just said, man, it would be really cool to um, be able to teach in a private sector. And I'd taken some, um, I guess you could say, postgraduate classes, not necessarily from a collegiate standpoint, but I had gone to a language school that was in Chapel Hill, where I had graduated college from. There was an outsourced private sector language school that I attended, and that was in 2000. And I'm like, they were on the brink of bringing in teaching language from an outside source, besides going to a collegiate, campus and learning the language. So I said, okay, that's cool. Never really, put two and two together, but I said, oh man, what if I could one day open up something similar to this, not necessarily a language school, but to be able to obtain clients and work with clients on a one-to-one basis or a small group basis in teaching language. So fast forward to 2017, I had a friend of mine, my ex roommate actually, or former roommate from college. He called me one day and he said, "Hey, Omar, I work at Blue Cross Blue Shield. I'm coming across, a lot of our clients are native speakers of Spanish. Is there any way that maybe you could give me some pointers and some refreshers on Spanish?" And he lived in, Greensboro, Winston-Salem area, which is not very close at all by driving distance to Charlotte. And I said, well, yeah, we can have classes on, over the phone. This is pre me figuring out how to have classes via the internet. So I'm like, yeah, man, we could have an hour class on the phone. And, we had about 12 sessions. And, it hit me. I was like, man, I can do this. I can open up a LLC and work this and make it become something. And so starting out in September 2017, I launched Carolina Language Solutions formally. And so starting out in 2017, I acquired a few, clients within the area of Charlotte. And then, I was basically going to meet these clients and, teaching them. And the majority of my clients are um, 27 and up, if you will.
Okay.
And I've taught from 20 to 78 as far as age range.
Wow.
Just for people that want to learn for either vacation purposes or, business purposes, or just because they want to learn Spanish because it's a very prominent language in the United States at this moment, and so people are wanting to be able to communicate with people within, in their native language. So I said, there's a need for people to learn Spanish. So initially, when I started the company, it was strictly, I'm just going to teach Spanish, and then as I continued to teach classes, people would ask, oh, do you offer any other languages? And at that point, I was like, no, because I only speak one. But then I was thinking, okay, all I got to do is, recruit a few other teachers that teach, these other languages, English for foreign language learners, French, Arabic, German. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to get inside my network. And when I say my network, the teachers that I've taught with over the years, and just ask them, hey, do you want to possibly pursue teaching adult clients? And absolutely, that was a response that I got from a lot of them. And so now we branched off into, teaching English as a foreign language in Charlotte. I have a teacher that also teaches Arabic. I have a teacher that teaches French. And I'm even now stretching it out even further across the state of North Carolina and South Carolina with a network of teachers as well, and having them basically set in different cities throughout North Carolina where they can grow the business, if you will, of Carolina Language Solutions, and expand on that market. See, that's a difference from what a lot of these schools are doing nowadays, the old antiquated approach to teaching language. Oh, we have a school here, come to us, as opposed to using technology in 2019 and being able to network and develop a web where you can have teachers across the state, across the region, and teach these languages and grow your business from a standpoint outside of a four-wall building, if you will.
Right.
So I've been working on that. I've also, now we worked it out where I now can accept clients throughout the United States. I'm doing virtual classes now in Spanish, so that's pretty awesome. I've done a few of those, and it's really exciting, man. Even for me to get clients from Miami, of all places in Miami, I'm like, you literally can walk outside of your door in Miami, and I at least thought that, but I know Spanish, but I think you can literally walk outside the door and learn Spanish, and people are like, no, not really. Nobody really wants to take the time to teach here. They just expect you to be able to speak it. And so that's why people, they reach out virtually, like, hey, can we do a face-to-face type thing? So I've started doing that, man. And it's taking the world by storm, if you will, and requiring a lot more time, and that's a good thing. It's definitely a good thing. I stay busy, if you will. So.
Well, that's awesome. And I think it's really cool because it leads me to the question, because I heard your passion, and I'm curious about, because you're a teacher, because being a teacher and being a language teacher are not exactly different, but are a little bit different. So what's your language learning philosophy?
I believe, and this is the thing, my philosophy is this: if you allow for a student to be immersed, even though they can't be fully immersed. And what I mean by fully immersed is, obviously, for example, you living in Colombia. Like, living in Colombia, that's fully immersed in a language. And so having students here in the United States, I have to make my classroom as similar to being in a foreign country or a Spanish speaking country. And so I'm one to believe that as a student crosses my threshold, what you're normally going to experience in my classroom is you're going to have the reggaeton playing in the morning, or the salsa or the bachata in the morning as you cross the threshold. And kids are like, oh, man, it's Spanish time, basically, in other
Yeah.
words. It's a subconscious move to get their mind to adjust from being in a weightlifting class, or being in a history class, or being in an English class, or whatever, and transition them slowly into the next 90 minutes being based fully in Spanish. And so that's my first thing, is to immerse you from a subconscious level. Secondly, I believe in the 90-10 rule. And the 90-10 rule basically for me is I'm going to speak 90% Spanish for this 90 minutes. So you might get 10 minutes of 90 minutes in English. And that 10 minutes is basically for me to, explain hard to understand concepts, grammatical concepts, or to relate something to you in English so that you can grasp the idea of what I'm trying to focus upon, to get you to remember something and how, we utilize it in Spanish. So 90-10 is a big thing for me. And even on the first day, and it's very hilarious to me as you walk into a level 2 class, or a level 1 class, or even a level 3, 4, and 5 class, where students are like, really, on the first day, you're just going to start speaking Spanish, But my thing is, I feel like repetition is key. And that's anything you do in life. Repetition is key. And you also have to realize that your brain is a muscle, and it grows as you produce, and you allow it to be challenged. Because I read something yesterday. I was in a gym, and it was on the wall. It said, if it doesn't challenge you, it's not helping you to grow, basically. And I feel like it was in a foreign language class. My challenge to you is to learn to appreciate and understand what I'm saying in the foreign language, and ultimately you'll begin to understand it slowly. And we have, 9 months, or we have, um, you know, uh, we have 8 weeks or whatever is from a semester standpoint. I'm sorry, 16 weeks, from a semester standpoint. So, you know, over that 16 weeks, you're going to be fully immersed. And I believe the key is constant interaction in that native language.
Yeah, and one of the things is me being here. I think an important thing, because I've basically done the immersion route myself, is the question that pops up in my mind is language learning more than vocabulary and learning rules. What do you think?
Right. So my thing with learning a language is exposure to different things within the language. And you can get exposure to a language without having to be in a verbal situation in language. For example, you walking down the street, from your apartment to the bus stop, or from your apartment, to or your house to the school. You're taking in language as you hear people pass you by, as you read signs, as you read billboards, or as you read posters. This is all language, and your brain is taking that in on a constant basis. And so you're learning even before you get into the classroom, if you will. And even before you sit down in a actual conversation and try to practice what you're learning. And so I'm a firm believer of being able to walk and take in everything that you see, smells, even just smelling food, and like, oh, what's that smell? Okay. And then people will say, well, this is blah, blah, blah. I know, oh, this is, pan de queso or whatever, or it's an empanada. And what is an empanada? And then where does that word come from? That's the type of thing you can learn from a language, not necessarily, oh, I got to look at page 26, or, oh, let me get on Duolingo and, do this little match dot, match this, match. That's learning a language, but that's from a different standpoint. I believe learning a language, you can learn language from various sectors as you just in your daily walk in life.
And an interesting thing is, a short sort of a synopsis of my story of being here. My first 6 months I was here. I don't know how much language I learned, but I was like, I was here. I left, went back to the States, and I was like, man, I need the Spanish. So I went back, and was in the States for a month, came back, and people said, oh, when you dream in Spanish, you know Spanish, or et cetera, et cetera. The moment when I felt like
Yeah.
I understood the language I was in was when I went to a movie, and I was in a program, so it was groups of people, different times, and we would watch movies with the subtitles. And so I have a practice of watching a movie in Spanish with the English subtitles, and then watching it in English. And so when I watched it in Spanish, I remember the movie was Coco. Coco came out. I watched Coco in Spanish, which is actually better in Spanish than it is in English, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
And I watched it, and I was listening, and I was reading the subtitles, and I'm like, that's not what they're saying. When I was able to read and say, that's not what they said, and then I watched other movies with Spanish subtitles in English, I'm like, that's not what's being said. Blew my mind. And that moment, I knew I learned something. So it actually leads me to my next question of, I think language consists of 4 parts: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. In your opinion,
yes, absolutely.
Which is the most important part to master first?
Listening. And the reason why I say that is this: it's not sign language. The only language that does not require, as far as communication between two people, and excluding technology, without it with that does not require speaking, is sign language.
Right.
Um, Listening is a key component to learning any language. And so I say that to say this, and this predates me. I'm a little older. However, growing up, there was an episode of Bart Simpson, when the Simpsons were on, and well, still on, but Bart Simpson did a study abroad in France or whatever.
Yeah.
And so this was like the best episode in my life, as far as understanding at an early age. I mind you, 13, 14, I guess. I don't remember how old I was. But watching that episode, and people can find it on YouTube. Just type in Bart Simpson in France. And so Bart goes over in a study abroad program, and his parents are like, "Oh, write us," and blah blah blah. And he thinks he's going off, to Paris and seeing the Eiffel Tower, and he gets stuck in this like winery and immersed in child labor and not being able to communicate in English and trying to tell people, "Help! I need help. These guys, they work me all night. All I do is stomp grapes and make wine." And he's there, and it's like it's going on, and they're working him to the bone, and eventually, he finds one day he's walking out on the street, it's raining, and he comes across this police officer, and he's speaking in English, and the police officer doesn't understand him, and he gets frustrated, and then next thing you know, snap, he goes into a full conversation, blown out in French, and then the police officer goes, "Oh, where are these guys?" And so that episode is in itself was the light bulb for me. Like, man, that's all it takes. At that point, Bart never spoke French. He never could understand how he was learning the language. He was not going to a class. He was literally locked into, a room stomping grapes. And he'd hear these guys talking every day. And, basically his learning the language came from a listening component. And so that brings me to what I said. Basically, my number one thing is for you to learn a language via listening first. And you brought up an interesting point as far as, the whole movie thing. And people ask me, they always ask me, and people that are native speakers, they'll say, well, how did you learn Spanish? That's their first question, man. That's because when you say you learn, Spanish, there's always that challenge of, okay, let's see what he knows,
Right.
And, when I rattle off, it's a face drop, a mouth drop moment. And so they're like, okay, so how'd you learn it? And I always tell people, I learned Spanish from watching novelas. I learned it from, watching noticias. I learned it from reading the newspaper. I learned it from ex-girlfriends that were, Puerto Rican or Dominican. I learned it from any capacity that I could outside the normal classroom setting. And so what I tell people that are native English speakers that want to learn Spanish, they ask, without taking a class, this is not even trying to bring them to my business because I don't necessarily want clients. I just get people that have the desire to learn. And if they want to learn from a academic sitting down in a class situation, then that's when I take you in. But the quickest way is, like you said, watching movies. The only difference that I would put on that is this. I've always believed, even growing up when I had to do my certification in Spanish to teach, in North Carolina, or any state for that matter, the best way for me to learn a language was to this is a key thing, take a movie that you know very well. Take that movie, and this is back in the day when DVDs were the big thing, So you take a movie, and they always had DVDs, and they would dub it, or they, the languages component. You could flip it to French, you could flip it to Spanish,
Right.
whatever language it is you're trying to learn. Flip it over from English to Spanish. And what I mean by that is take a movie that you know very well. For example, my favorite movie growing up in my early 20s was Friday.
Okay.
And so I knew Friday like the back of my hand, and so I would take that movie and I'd flip it into Spanish, and I would just watch it over and over and over again in Spanish with no subtitles because I could tell what was going on because I knew the movie like the back of my head. But what I wanted to do is listen to, take in the Spanish, and then eventually I would put up the Spanish subtitles. I never did the English subtitles because I knew the movie. Do you understand what I'm saying? And so that's fully immersing yourself in the language without using any components of, your native language. And so that's a thing that I think that people need to think about. If you want to learn whatever language you want to run, if you have an opportunity to flip it over into that desired language that you want to learn, just listen to it. And don't get frustrated when you don't, oh man, I don't understand what they're saying, or they're speaking a mile a minute. Who cares? You know what the movie is. Just continue to watch it over and over. And it takes me back to, a quote or a line from a famous song from back in the 90s. There was a guy that said, I listened to my tape till my tape pop.
Right.
Basically, you listen to the cassette tape until the actual little brown band and it broke. That's how much you listen to that song, and that's how much it's the same concept. Listen to it until you literally, figuratively break that DVD or you break that movie where it won't play anymore. If you do that continuously, repetition, like I said, repetition. If you do that continuously, the language will eventually show up in the most inopportune moment, as you can see with Bart Simpson. So, yes.
And, it's interesting because you kind of alluded to it, but I'm going to ask the question directly. So how do you get listening speed improved? Because the biggest thing was, I remember when I would say to people, they would talk to me, and if they said it slowly, I would understand better. But I understood that people didn't enjoy having conversations if they had to change the way they talked. If they weren't comfortable talking, it would make them uncomfortable.
Right.
So I decided to stop asking people to speak slowly, and what I would focus on, and this is a me thing, I was focused on listening for verbs and what they were saying, because I normally knew the verbs, and if I knew the verb, I could understand context. So for you, how does a person get the listening speed to slow down in their head while the person is still speaking normally?
There's a simple trick, and you just alluded to it. The thing is this: you never need to understand every single word when you're learning a foreign language. And because we're learning on a daily basis. And so when you're in a conversation with people, I always tell people context clues are your best friend. And so what I mean by that is this. For example, even when people speak to me now, I'm getting older. It's harder for me to understand and hear in English. I'm just getting older. My hearing is not as well as it used to be. And that's mainly because, growing up as a high school student, speakers in the trunk, whatever, I blew my ears. Anyways, I say that to say this. When people speak to me in English or in Spanish, I'm at a situation now in my life, basically, I just have to literally listen and then formulate what I think they're speaking about and then produce a response to it. Now, granted, they might say, well, I didn't ask you that. I said this. And I'm like, oh. So now what I've just done is redirected or had them restate what they said without asking them to say, oh, could you please say that slower? Or could you please speak up? Or, in other words, I'm producing the language and then I'm redirecting them to restate whatever they've said.
Brilliant.
And so at that point, and so you're never really losing the actual flow of the conversation. You're just taking in what they give you, just like you said, and then you're using context to base what you're going to do in response. And I think that's a very key thing. Context clues are your best friend. And people, people that are learning foreign languages are they have anxiety levels, and I don't know where that comes from. It's just people, certain people. Yeah, I know what it is. Most people, you learn in the United States, you go through school, you don't want to mess up. You don't want to make a mistake. You're always taught in school, oh, you made a mistake, oh, correct your mistake. And then people, as you go through life, it's just, oh, you made a mistake. That's the concept that you learn day by day in a job or in school. And so with language, you have to be willing to set yourself outside of your normal daily routine of trying to correct mistakes and make mistakes as you speak. Does that make sense?
It does, and it actually leads me to my next question of, once I found out I could understand what people were saying by focusing on verbs in the conversation, and I always had to have context. Like if someone randomly came to talk to me, I would struggle because I'm like, you're just randomly talking to me. I don't know what you're talking about. But the next level was, okay, the overcoming the fear of speaking, because it wasn't a matter of being afraid of speaking so much, because in your head you have responses. It's slower, but you have them. But it's the fear of saying it, because one, you don't want to be wrong, but obviously making mistakes is how you learn. But the second thing, it's actually a social context, is when you talk to people, if you make mistakes and you have confidence, even though you're, hey, I make my mistake, whatever, it's the response of people laughing or sort of being sort of critical of you when you make mistakes. How do you overcome the societal, hey, you made a mistake, I'm going to focus on your mistake? And you're like, hey, man, I answered you. Can you just answer what I'm saying?
Right. And that goes to a whole nother level of pride and humility. It's just that's literally what it comes down to. How much pride do you have in yourself to be able to make? I could go through a entire growing up and learning Spanish. At first, everybody has that, man, I don't want to be wrong, or oh, I know they're getting irritated because I'm making all these mistakes. But actually, and as you've probably found out, people know when you're a native speaker and not a native
Oh, they
speaker.
do.
But in the Spanish speaking world, in Latin America, people that are native speakers are so elated for the simple fact that an American wants to learn to speak Spanish. And they're so happy that you're taking even the slightest opportunity to try to communicate in their native language. Albeit there are other languages that they kind of turn their nose up at you when you say things wrong. Or oh, I don't understand you, and they just walk away. There are those there are those languages. However, Spanish is not one of those. I've found in the various countries that I've gone to and traveled to, people they're so patient when you are actually trying to speak in Spanish. And so you just have to break yourself away from the norm, the societal norm in the United States of, oh, I don't want to make this mistake, or oh, I feel like this person, you never know until you actually get in that conversation. And a lot, 90, I would say 98 or 99% of the time that I've spoken with people that are native speakers, I'll be, in the United States or in Latin America, I've never had an issue where people would say, oh, I'm done. I'm fed up with this. I'm stressed, and you're stressing me out because you don't understand what I'm trying to say. I've never had that issue when it comes to Spanish. And so I think people just have, people that are wanting to learn Spanish and, any other language for that matter, but you just have to be um, aware that you are going to make mistakes, and you just have to take what you can get as you move along throughout the language. And be okay with making mistakes, because you're going to learn from the mistakes and the key thing in Spanish is, I've noticed, and you probably noticed it as well, when you make a mistake in a conjugation, or you use the wrong noun, or term for something when that's not what it is. Oftentimes, in an involuntary way, or in a subliminal way, the person that you're speaking to is going to correct you,
Yes.
and they're going to restate what you said, and they're going to say it correctly, and that goes boom. Oh, I should say it like this, and that's something that's imprinted in your mind, because next time you have to say that phrase or you have to use that verb, you're going to remember it because of that situation. And it's amazing how the brain works with that. So I think I'm all about making mistakes, because if you're making mistakes, that means you're trying and you're practicing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
And the thing that I found interesting, even though I do have an episode where I was speaking the language and it was clear what I was saying. I had a person who didn't want me. They got frustrated. I got in a taxi. The taxi driver heard me speak. He could tell I wasn't a native, and then he got uncomfortable, and he's like, yeah, I don't want to take you where you're going. I'm like, dude, are you serious? So he kicked me out the taxi. I got in the next taxi. I was mad. Got in a new taxi, and the next taxi driver wanted to practice English with me. So I was like, wow,
there
the
you go.
universe does whatever it does, and you go from there. Now I have it.
Right, it's a
It
trade-off.
is, and an interesting thing is you mentioned some places you traveled. So which location you traveled to that you thought was the best? That gave you the best sort of immersion experience for your time wherever you went.
Oh, man. Okay, so best immersion experience, and I would say this is not even from a language learning. This is just being in an area where, man, we just don't speak English. Because I would say that would be Cuba. Cuba, you might know, there might be out of 10 people, if we had to, I had 10 Cubans in Cuba lined up, one Cuban would know English.
Wow.
Um, and so, and that that just comes from the whole U.S. embargo thing, and people not coming back and forth between Cuba, obviously, because if you leave Cuba, that whole scenario.
Right.
So the thing is, in Cuba, It's literally you gotta know Spanish. You gotta know, or you gotta know somebody that knows Spanish, or you gotta know somebody that lives there that speaks English. Because I think that is probably deep for me personally. That is the one area where English is limited.
Yeah.
There is not there's not a large tourist, you know, um, I guess influx
Right.
of Americans,
Right.
obviously. And so the only, English that they're really exposed to is Canadian and British English. And how often do Brits come? I don't know. I know Canadians are there, but who knows if they're English, speaking Canadians or they're French Canadians. So there's that aspect. So that is one of the things that I would say, yeah, Cuba, without a doubt, was probably the biggest immersion experience I've had in my life. Yeah.
Awesome. You know what I found interesting, and this is sort of for people listening, is when I went to Puerto Rico, I went to Puerto Rico last year. And I mean, I know they speak English there, but
Uh-huh.
if you can speak Spanish in Puerto Rico, it's a fantastic immersion experience because they're
Right.
Americans, but you can speak
Right.
Spanish fluently because there's a lot of Puerto Ricans that don't speak any English. And I was kind of
That's
mind
very
blown
true.
by that because I'm like, wow, my experience was heightened because of that because I went with my cousin for his birthday and it was me and a group of my cousins, and I was like, wow, this is different. And I was the only one who spoke Spanish, so it was like, dude, like it took Puerto Rico to another place, and I'm like, we're in America still, and I just thought it was amazing.
Right. Right.
I want to go to Cuba, so that intrigues me about that. So a quick question about philosophy, and then we're going to talk about uh, what people should and maybe consider passing on doing when they learn language. So there, I saw there were like five
Okay.
philosophies on learning language. So there's one that's driven by error correction. There's one
Uh huh.
that is immersion and societal. There's one that believes that you have an innate understanding of language in general in your brain. It's already built in. And then there's one where your brain has to be conditioned to learn or practice. And then there's the blank
Uh
slate
huh.
where as you just put stuff in, you learn from sensory. What would you think is
Right.
the most regularly used or fluently used or the most powerful philosophy of learning language of those?
All right. Give them to me one more time,
So
and I'm gonna shoot out a number for you. Just give me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'll let you know.
awesome. So number one, I have driven by error correction. Number two, I have
Okay.
immersion and societal. Number three, I have innate
Okay.
understanding is already built inside of you. Number four, I have must be conditioned to learn, which is basically practicing. And number five is the blank slate where you learn from sensory. So like environment will put it inside of you.
Okay. My choice would be my number one is immersion.
Immersion. Okay, cool. And it's interesting because there's so many different philosophies that are out there, and it's just for it's different strokes for different folks, so to speak. But I think that part is important for the next question, which is what things should people embrace and let go of when they decide that they're going to learn a language. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah. Say that one more time for me.
Yeah. What things should people embrace and let go of when they decide they're going to learn a language?
Oh, okay. Things that they let go. Um, the I hate to say it, and I'm going to speak from an American standpoint. Three things that people let go. Number one, they let go of the idea that English is the only language people should basically know. Uh, this is one of the things that's very controversial in the United States. People obviously, even our leader of the free world has stated, you basically, if you don't like it here, you should go back to where you came from. And I take that in context from a language standpoint. Basically, if you don't speak English and you can't maneuver and function within our country in English, you don't need to be here. And so people that are learning a foreign language as Americans, I believe they let go of the concept that English should be the only language spoken in the United States. Uh, and they believe that, man, how much more, how much greater of a person can I, be if I decided to learn a foreign language. Um,
Right.
and so that's the number one thing. Um, the next thing I would say is the ability to be able to communicate as you travel. Travel is a big thing for a lot of people, nowadays. Getting that passport and moving throughout the world, and picking up a few phrases is just life changing. Especially when you say something that somebody's like, "Oh yeah, I know that," or they get that light bulb goes like, "Oh yeah, I know what you said," and you're like, oh my god," they just understood what I said in another language. And so I think travel is a big thing for a lot of people that kind of pushes and motivates people. Three, this is a totally different thing, but it's very new. It's not very new, but it's something that people are starting to realize in the United States. They're learning that or I take that back. In the world, people are understanding that if you know a foreign language, and it depends on where you are, if you know a foreign language, it can potentially increase your salary twofold, or it can even give you
Amen.
the opportunity to get a job that the other person or the next candidate or the next highest potential candidate that puts you even above them, regardless of what their grades are or their GPA was in college. Knowing a foreign language can put you above that person. Knowing multiple foreign languages can put you above a person as far as in a competitive standpoint of getting a job. So I would think that's number three for me.
Okay. And it's interesting because I read a stat maybe a month or two ago, maybe a year ago, and it said if you can speak English and Spanish, just those two languages,
Right.
you can communicate with 80% of the people in the world. That's
Yeah.
mind
Yep.
blowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's absolutely
Absolutely.
mind blowing.
Absolutely. 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 Yep. I totally agree. Totally agree.
So, with all of that, I think you gave some valuable context for people to actually go out and learn language. I think it enhances your life. The money part is really, really important in my
Right.
perspective, since Americans I think, are money driven
Right.
in some sense. So,
Right.
because it is what you do, what would be the best way for people to contact you and to start setting themselves up to immerse themselves in language? So now that we've discussed all those things that should be reasons for people to want to learn language, especially just as accessibility to the world and an interconnected world, what's the best way for people to connect to you? Because you offer solutions for things that could make their lives better. So I'm gonna let you give the information on how to contact you and the mannerisms and methods that are important to get partnered with you so they can start their process.
Okay, so there are numerous ways. First off, the website, once again, www.multilingo.co, multingo.co. You can email me at info at sign ampersand or ampersand info at multilingo.co. You can also contact me via phone 704 781 8911. WhatsApp. You can definitely find me on WhatsApp, Instagram. Instagram Carolina Language Solutions. You can type that in on Instagram. Twitter. I'm on NC Lang, LANG Solutions. You can find me there as well. So that's pretty much it, man, as far as being able to contact me. And of course, you can go through Lewis, and he can get you the information you need.
Absolutely great. Well, Omar, I want to thank you. If there's anything you want to leave the listeners with, I'm going to go ahead and leave the last word to you.
I would just say this: don't be afraid to make mistakes in a language. If you want to learn, it's literally like going to the gym. It's a workout. It's gonna take time. You're gonna have to invest in it. You can learn it for free. You can take classes, but whatever you do, uh, of the desire that you want to have to learn that language, and just watch, even using minimal phrases, You can see how the light bulb goes off for you. You can see how easy it is to learn to communicate with people that don't speak your native language and the language that you're trying to learn. And it just opens doors exponentially for you in your future. So good luck with that. And, if you need any insights, you can email me or hit me on the website or find me on Instagram or Twitter. Um, I would be more than happy to help you, help guide you in the direction that you need to go.
All right. Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it, and have a fantastic day.
Hey, you too, sir. Have a great weekend.
All right, man.
All right. Bye bye.